welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for October 8th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by Jim Clausing and John Hogoboom. I'm Brian Rexroad. And Jim, let's talk a little bit about 0 days, and I guess there was another one that hopefully we're on the path to fix.
Yeah, we've talked on a couple of previous shows about the recent Internet Explorer 0 day, and Microsoft had released a fix-it for it 2 weeks ago or thereabouts. That was only available for the 32-bit version. Well, today is Microsoft Patch Tuesday, and they have patched that 0 day that was being actively exploited. It initially was mostly targeting folks in Japan and maybe Korea. And about a week ago, there was an article in the Register that since the exploit was out there in the wild, there was even a Metasploit module for it. It was starting to be used more widely. So Microsoft patched that today. That's one that you definitely should apply in a hurry. There's also another interesting blog post today from out of Spider Labs, TrustWave's Spider Labs, about another 0 day, which fortunately also got patched today in that same MS13-080 patched 2 0 days that were actively being exploited in the wild. This was another one that was primarily targeting Japanese and Korean users. Not sure why they were going after that right now. But this one, again, was primarily targeting Japanese and Korean users. This one was only going after folks running IE8 on Windows XP. The previous one was going after several different versions of IE, but this one was only going after IE8 on XP. And it was dropping something like 10 or 15 different payloads on the box. It was dropping drivers, executables, DLLs, going after a number of things. It would shut off some security software. It was going after passwords for online games, World of Warcraft, Diablo 3, a couple others I don't remember off the top of my head. It was going after banking credentials. There was a lot of stuff that this particular one was dropping, and a lot of things they were going after, but they were only targeting Japanese and Korean Net Explorer 8 on X.
So let me ask a question here. You mentioned it was only targeting Internet Explorer 8 on XP, and isn't XP beyond its support lifecycle?
I believe that it finally leaves support in this coming April.
Okay, so that would explain why they still have the patches in there at this point, even though, that would be something that folks will going to be paying attention to, is to get beyond XP in the near future, because it will be beyond its support path. And as you've noted here, there are still 0 days that can ultimately, have implications on XP. Yep.
And it's, they actually extended the life of XP several times already, so users really do need to get off of it if they're still using it.
Right. So that's technically Windows 2003, if I remember correctly, right? So basically going on 11 years.
Yeah, it's something like that.
Right.
So
it sounds like that particular example exploit was kind of targeting, sort of opportunities for monetary gain. That it's actually quite popular to be trying to get gaming exploits or access codes and sell those on a gray market, and sort of banking credentials, the opportunity to perform some sort of bank transaction fraud, that sort of thing. So it seems to have a little bit of a distinction from some of what we typically tend to associate with a zero-day, which might be, some more sophisticated or tending to target toward, technology theft or industrial espionage-type activities.
Yeah, now the one thing that I should probably point our viewers to, they should go read either the Spider Labs blog or the Microsoft the Security Research and Defense blog post about MS-13-080. The attacks here were redirecting the users to a couple of IPs in the same /24 network, 1.234.31, which was really odd. But it's the same attack group that was doing the same IP range where some of the earlier attacks against the Japanese and Korean users were coming from. So, folks might want to check their proxy logs, firewall logs for that network and be on the lookout. There were a number of URLs in those two blog posts where they had seen the malicious payloads. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one of the things that perhaps is overlooked in some enterprises. I mean, I think many companies are global now, and they're expanding that. And it's a little bit of a mind shift change in thought that's necessary to consider the fact that some types of activity, this is an example, may be kind of localized to certain countries, but as you expand to a global company, develop partnerships, it's important to be cognizant of the activities going on internationally and how they might affect your enterprise. So, all right, thanks, Jim. And I guess what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit, not an entirely unrelated topic here. This is a news article that came out of USA Today that's talking about how a recent hack against Adobe, which exposed at least some source code associated with a couple of their applications, as a part of that activity. Apparently what had happened is the source code was discovered on an external server, and there was some disclosure about that. But, the theme of this is that it could fuel the next wave of cyber attacks, kind of leading to the point that, perhaps if you have source code, the opportunity to identify zero-day exploits is much easier. And I'm not going to argue that point, but I think it's important to note that just because the source code is out there doesn't necessarily make it less secure. In fact, as we were just talking about here, the Internet Explorer source code isn't out there, and yet we were just talking about a couple of zero-day exploits that weren't necessarily something that you would describe as nation-state sponsored, for example. These at least appear to be monetarily motivated and, taking gaming accesses and, trying to perform bank fraud, that sort of thing. So I encourage you to take a look at the article, make a judgment for yourself. I think, certainly having that source code out there doesn't make things necessarily any better, but at the same time, perhaps it inspires to take a little closer look at the source code and see what opportunities exist to fix any problems that show up.
And just because, Adobe has said that they're not aware of any exploits in the wild yet, but I also wouldn't expect any for maybe a little bit of time here, as, somebody needs to kind of go through this. So whoever was able to get this stuff, the source code, would need some time to digest that in order to figure out an exploit path. But.
A lot of the discoveries of exploits, not necessarily the exploit itself, but the existence of a potential to perform an exploit, I think are perhaps more easily discovered through fuzzing activities than perhaps even reviewing the code itself. That is, going through the code, I think this is arguable that the process of actually going through the code and trying to identify problems in there is perhaps even a little more difficult than going in and just doing things that the software probably isn't expecting, and then seeing how it reacts. And it may cause it to crash or behave in a strange way, but that's a hint that there may be some possibility of doing something, and it allows attackers to do something better. So I think, again, the point here is that, yes, source code may help to find a zero-day exploit a little bit more easily, but it's certainly keeping the source code a secret isn't a protection mechanism in itself. So with that, let's pass it back to Jim here. And Jim, there have been a number of things going on with iOS lately, and what would you like to share?
Yeah, well, this one was one that I wasn't really aware of until my friend Johannes Ulrich over at the Internet Storm Center posted something on it. But iOS 7 added the ability to do Multipath TCP. And I wasn't really familiar with Multipath TCP. It's described in RFC 6824, which is not an RFC that I had ever read. But what I thought was interesting about it is, not something that I would have necessarily recognized in a packet capture or TCP dump if I was watching the traffic on my network. Basically, Multipath TCP allows you to have separate TCP connections and send part of your data stream over one and part of it over another. Mm-hmm. And it adds a new TCP option and essentially uses some information in that TCP option to have your own sequence numbers for each TCP stream, and then using this TCP option, you number it so that the ultimate end user can reassemble things from multiple TCP connections. Like I said, I wasn't really familiar with Multipath TCP, hadn't really seen any of it, but it is now in iOS 7. The advantage of it is if you've got a mobile device that's roaming from one network to another and potentially changing IP addresses in the middle of a conversation, the Multipath TCP, as long as you can keep both addresses live for a short period of time, with the Multipath TCP, using the old TCP connection, you can inform the server you're moving to a new IP address, so that when the new connection comes in, it continues transferring the data over the new connection, which that's very useful with mobile devices when you're roaming, moving from LTE to Wi-Fi to 3G, right, whatever. Right now, the only application that I'm aware of that takes advantage of it in iOS 7 is Siri. But the OS has support for it now, so other applications could take advantage of it in the future. Mm-hmm. And Johannes has an example in TCP dump really doesn't know how to decode that particular TCP option. Wireshark and T-Shark do, so he's got a good example there in the blog post if you're interested in seeing what that looks like. But it was interesting. It was something new to me, so I thought I'd share it with our audience.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'm envisioning the kids sitting in the back watching a video as you're traveling, hundreds of miles down the interstate, and are sure to be going across several cell sites, and in the process of doing that, probably have to switch IP addresses, and heaven forbid the movie get interrupted. So it's good to see that the technology to keep our kids entertained in the back seat of the car in the future is evolving properly. And on that note, I guess certainly I think there are going to be more and more persistent applications. I think we typically think of smart devices as you look up directions or something like that. But as we go on, I think more persistent applications are going to be looking for connections that transition a little more seamlessly than they have in the past. So good developments on a more serious note. So I guess we've had a couple of patches come out recently as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we had spoken on a previous program that Apple had released iOS 7.0.1 within a few days after iOS 7 was released to solve a few vulnerabilities that were discovered. And I think it was the day after, or the day of, or the day after I was last on the show, they released another one, 7.0.2, which took care of a lock screen vulnerability, a bypass issue. And now there is some rumblings out there. There are a couple of blog posts that suggest that there may be a 7.0.3 as soon as this week, and maybe a 7.1 when some new devices are released potentially later this month. Really, my only point in bringing it up is that Apple has... I have criticized Apple in the past for taking a long time to patch vulnerabilities after they knew about them. They have done a very good job of, when new vulnerabilities have been found in iOS 7 here, they've been really quick about fixing them and releasing updates, especially since a couple of them were pretty significant. This lock screen bypass was pretty significant. So they've been doing a really good job here of fixing the vulnerabilities as soon as they find them or find out about this new patch.
If you hadn't made the comment, I would have. And I guess one of the things I have observed is I have lots of friends that have iPhones, and they've been asking, should I do this? Should I not? It's telling me to do an update. I just did one, and I said, it said, yes, you should do that. So I guess, a lot of us probably watching or obviously participating in this program are involved in security and IT activities, but there are a lot of folks here that are using these devices that's certainly outside of that environment. And so make sure they understand that these patches are for their good.
Yep, absolutely. The folks my friends and family that have iOS devices, I've been urging them to apply these right away.
Mm-hmm. So since we're on the mobile malware topic, we've talked a little bit about Apple's products. I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Google's products. So, John, what can you tell us?
So thanks, Brian. Actually, I've got kind of a point-counterpoint, and I'll try not to take an opinion either way on this. But we had a story. There's a story that came out recently. Google's Android security chief, announced some report and some findings. They did some data mining of their of the Android App Store to look at the types of applications that have gotten in there, what's been downloaded, and it also includes downloads from other non-Google store fronts, some of those third-party store fronts. This study, but basically what it determined is that less than 0.001% of app installations on Android are able to evade the system's multi-layered defenses and cause harm to the user. So basically, a very, very small percentage of the apps being installed are malicious in nature. And then when they did a little bit more studying of that, they determined 40% are fraudware. When they say fraudware, usually that's ones where once it gets on the phone, it starts either text messaging to these premium services or doing something to rack up a bill. 40% rooting apps, which are kind of rootkit type things, and 15% commercial spyware, which are keyloggers, things of that nature. And so I guess in some respect you have to consider the source here, because we have other reports from other AV vendors such as F-Secure, who have put stories out recently this year that says 96% of all mobile malware is on Android. So you've got the Google guy saying, well, it's kind of being over-exaggerated here. Malware on the Android platform is really not that bad. And in truth, maybe it's not that bad, but when you're kind of the only platform that's really got a problem with malware, or any malware at all, I guess I should say, and some of these other vendors don't have as much or very little, you kind of get an overinflated result as a result of that. So, and then the last story kind of tying all this together is that the smartphone market share, so the IDC, International Data Corporation, they kind of do these kind of independent studies, and they determined that in the second quarter of this past year, 2013, this year, that Android accounted for almost 80% of the entire market share of smartphones. So when you look at the amount of smartphones out there, of course, whoever has the most market share and most devices out there are probably going to have more of a chance of having malware on them. You know, it's just like saying there's more malware on Windows platform for the PCs, and yes, that's true, but there's probably a lot more Windows platform machines out there in general. So one of the things I thought was kind of interesting takeaways, going back to the first slide here, is, you know, Android has a very open approach. Their hardware is open. Their source code is open. So, and we kind of talked about this before, you know, having open source code is not necessarily a bad thing because it allows other people to independently review it and find security vulnerabilities. So you're going to have a mixture of good guys in there and some bad guys looking for exploit paths. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, NSA released a security add-on for Android, and a lot of people are a little bit jumpy about that. Why is the NSA making a security add-on for my Android, you know, mobile phone? But the upside of that is it's all open source, so all of their code is open source as well, so everybody can independently review it and make sure that there's nothing sketchy going on in there. And having an open platform allows them to, you know, leverage more market share, so which they've been doing. On the contrast, you know, Apple, with their iOS platform, has very little amounts of malware in the, you know, very low numbers. And, you know, it's hard to say whether I would say for the most part that's because they have a very locked down type of architecture. The hardware is locked down, the software is locked down, their app store is locked down, so you don't really have access to source code, you don't have access to the hardware platform, you know, from independent vendors making their own devices. And it's kind of a little bit, in my opinion, a security through obscurity. They've hidden so much of what's happening behind the scenes of your phone that really there's not a good way to find exploits unless you're just trying to brute force them out or fuzz them or, you know, what we were talking about earlier. So interesting story. I just thought it was an interesting point-counterpoint that you've got Google saying, you know, Android it's being a little over-exaggerated, but then you've got other AV vendors saying, well, is it really? Because, you know, the Android platform is where most of the mobile malware is. So.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of perspective here. Just out of curiosity, you happen to know if the 0.001% is associated with specifically the Main Street market, or if it's looking across markets?
They said it was looking across markets, but I'm not sure how deeply that is. But it goes across, I guess, all of their handsets or whatever's, you know, somehow they have a way to track whether it's installed from a third party as well as their own storefront.
Okay. I think that's one of the significant aspects of this is that, you know, we've said it many times, we're going to keep on saying it, that when you're going to the mainstream markets, there is better scrutinization of the apps, and if there are complaints associated with those apps that eventually they're going to get pulled off the market, hopefully quickly enough that it doesn't create a significant concern. So relatively speaking, compared to sort of the PC space where malware gets emailed around quite frequently and ends up, you know, rootkitting the machine, and a lot of the proliferation of malware these days, in fact, is through emails. And John, you've done a number of reports. I hope we get to see another one of those again soon. It's much more prolific in that sense, whereas in the case of the mobile devices, they are generally what I would describe as more impervious to, comparatively speaing. But now when we start comparing from a different reference point, that is comparing to other mobile devices perhaps, clearly there is a difference. And the question is here, is that difference significant enough to really influence your purchase decision, for example? And I think it's a good argument on both sides.
Yeah, it's 0.004 whatever 0.001%.
Small number.
small number, of a very large number of installs, because people are always adding new apps to their phones or their tablets. So, it can be a very, very small percentage and still be a relatively significant number total. So,
absolutely true.
Not necessarily contradictory.
Right. John, you mentioned the security enhancements, and there was a Linux SE. I don't know how popular it become, but it actually was chock full of security features. And again, I think that was actually a set of enhancements that were probably done through. I'm not specifically familiar with the security enhancements for Android, but I think the Linux SE was probably done through a very similar, if not the same, path. And the intent there, at least, was that for users that have a desire to really lock down their platforms, provide greater granularity and access controls and that sort of thing, that they can apply that additional enhancement and use it in those environments. So clearly, our government that's sensitive about their some projects and activities that they're performing are interested in enhancing the security of devices. So I suspect that was the motivation behind your comments about NSA's enhancements.
Right. I'm not sure what the pedigree or the history behind this Android version is, but it does sound very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the Internet weather for the last week or so. And I think at the top of the list here, what I'd like to share with you is some recent denial of service attack activity. This one's kind of interesting in the sense that it's not interesting. To sort of put it another way, a lot of our discussion when we talked about denial of service attacks, and in fact over the last several months, has been very oriented toward DNS reflection attacks, also discussion about SNMP reflection attacks, which generally have not been as large but as the DNS reflection attacks, but certainly growing in prominence, the frequency of events. And what we've seen here is actually sort of a series of sort of the return of the TCP SYN attacks. And at least in recent memory, haven't seen any significant events. There's one in particular that happens to be ongoing, and you can see sort of this blue shaded area and a number of other spikes, but all of these appear to be associated with TCP SYN type attacks that have been going on. So the old attacks don't go away. They just sometimes they take a little bit of a little sabbatical, and then the attackers bring them back to life. None of these attacks are what I would describe as significant. They're not creating a huge amount of bandwidth. One of them happens to be in mitigation, but it's not something that I would consider to be a serious threat. Just something you need to be prepared for. The next one here, scan probes on port 8009 TCP. This one is actually associated with the Apache JServe protocol. And I'm not going to pretend like I have a full understanding of what the JServe protocol is for, but it has something to do with sort of the back-end applications. I believe it might be used by Tomcat. 30 days of activity is shown here, and the majority of the probes are sourced from China. I think there are basically 2 or 3 addresses that are involved in this activity. There was one other that was U.S.-based, but it's significantly lower in terms of the volume of activity. And as you can see, it seems like there have been a couple of significant spikes over the last 30 days, and then more recently an increase in the frequency of events that are taking place associated with this. So if you're using, in which many people are, if you're using Apache web server, you might want to take a close look and make sure that the access supports is from the internet is as you expect or want them to be.
And, we've talked about in the past, there has been a lot of brute force attacks against Apache Tomcat's admin interface. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if this is a next level of that or a similar actor set involved here, but it's probably one that you definitely want to take, close look at if you are running, anything on port 8009 TCP, especially if it's Tomcat or Apache related.
Right. We've seen cases where the web servers have been used as sort of a hot point to get into enterprises, for example. And so it's not just about what's on the web server. It's about what could be accessed behind those web servers that you need to be concerned about.
Right.
Next item here is scan probes on port 5902 TCP. This is associated with the virtual network computing application. It's actually an alternate port, so typically the primary port associated with VNC is 5000, but if you have multiple instances running on a device, that it will basically sequence to 5901, 5902, that sort of thing. So we're seeing probing activity on this particular port, and it seems to be again, sort of an increase in the frequency of events associated with this as much as anything else. Again, showing 30 days of activity, and around, I guess, third week in September, we started seeing more frequent events, and it seems like they've gotten a little bit more aggressive since then. Between September 30th and October 6th, a couple of spikes in just the recent couple of days as well. And the next one here, an old friend of ours, port 6667. This is associated with IRC. It's probably the most popular port used for Internet relay chat. And we know and love IRC from its sort of the underground of the Internet in one respect, but often used for botnet command and control in the past. In fact, the early botnets were really created for good purposes on IRC channels and basically adapted to perform sort of the more nefarious botnet activities, command and control activities. Most of the botnets have moved away from that, but for some reason somebody's scanning around looking for IRC ports, and actually it's approximately 100 different addresses, all from Taiwan, that showed up in this activity. So it does suggest that there's a botnet behind this, and what we see is basically sort of a start of activity just around the 2nd of October, peaking out, and relatively frequent activity I guess on the 3rd of October, and then continuing with less frequent spikes since then. So certainly if you're running an IRC chat server, you want to be paying attention to that sort of activity and see if there's anything that might be going on. We've seen actually in a number of cases in the past, by the way, that even legitimate IRC chat servers will get used for botnet command and control. They'll set up basically just a channel for that function and kind of hide in the noise, so to speak. And that is something that anybody running an IRC chat server needs to be paying attention to. You don't want to be a part of the problem. Next item, we'll just take a look at the most probed ports here, and we're seeing activity on port 53 UDP. A lot of this I'm attributing to DNS amplification attack activity. That is, what tends to happen is if there is a DNS amplification attack that appears as if there's a source, there will be basically a spoof source address that's creating lots of queries to lots of DNS servers, and so that looks a little bit like scanning activity. There's a single source going to lots of destinations, and so it gets picked up in our probing algorithm. Port 445 is certainly prominent here. We have the peer-to-peer protocols associated with zero-access botnet in this 16,000 ranges here. We have some probing activity on port 1433 TCP, and some probing activity on port 22 and port 3389. 3389 being remote desktop protocol, which between 22 and 3389, as well as 1433, by the way, we've often associated with password guessing attacks. Now, there was a recent article we were going to hopefully follow up in a later episode about sort of the evolution of the very slow and persistent botnets that would be doing these types of password guessing attacks. So that's going to be hopefully a good discussion next time. Next one is in terms of the most sources doing the probing. Not much of interest here. Port 445 is, as usual, at the top of the list, and we see the peer-to-peer activity associated with the zero-access botnet, and then port 80 TCP is probably the primary notable one here that is shown up on the list. So lots of probes looking for web servers. And since zero-access botnet P2P activity is showing up so prominently, I wanted to show you why. The zero-access botnet, I think there was an article by Symantec not too long ago. In fact, we may have even talked about it in the episode 2 weeks ago, related to basically a takedown operation that had been performed by Symantec, and it was relatively effective, I think, for a period of time here, but right around the end of August and certainly in the beginning of September, there was a bit of a revival, and that might be an understatement, a revival of the zero-access botnet. I think it actually, in terms of activity, is perhaps beyond what we had even ever seen before. So it looks like the zero-access botnet is alive and well, and in fact continuing to grow. In fact, since September, there's been sort of a steady climb and a very strong upward trajectory. So it appears that they're infecting additional devices as we speak.
Yeah, it's a little disconcerting that they tried to squash it and it came back even stronger here, it looks like. Yeah,
it's almost as if it infuriated the actors in this case.
Yeah.
And along those same lines, I hadn't shared the reconnaissance index for a while, so I thought we'd take a quick look at that. And there is actually a couple of interesting things to observe here. First of all, I've been reporting for some time sort of a downward trend. This is a good thing. That is, what we're looking at is the basically relative level of probes as well as the relative level of sources that are doing that probing. So it's basically sort of a timeline combined view of those pie charts that we were just looking at. Around, again, the end of August here, we started to see sort of an upward trend, both in terms of the number of sources doing the probing as well as in the number of probes that are taking place. And this will be, I expect, mostly attributable to the regrowth of that zero-access botnet. So that peer-to-peer activity looks a little bit like reconnaissance from the algorithm's point of view, and obviously from an analyst's point of view, we have to make a distinction between the two. But then there are a couple of very strong spikes, not in terms of the number of sources, but in the number of probes. And these were some, what I would describe as outlying DNS reflection attack activity. So as I described earlier, when someone is performing queries using a spoof source address as the target of attack, spreading that out to many open DNS resolvers across the internet, that looks a little bit like scanning activity as well. It's not technically reconnaissance activity in the strictest definition, but it certainly has similar behavior. And that shows up here as probes in the reconnaissance index. So the combination of the zero-access botnet growth and the what I would describe as outliers in terms of the DNS reflection attack activities has driven the reconnaissance index significantly higher than what we've typically seen. And that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can get in touch with us through email at threattrack@list.att.com, the old traditional way. And if you'd like to be a little more forward about it, there's always Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. The ThreatTraq video is available at the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. You can subscribe to an audio-only version also on iTunes if you choose just the audio version. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Jim and John. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.